Okay, hi everyone. So today we're doing table of evidence, and it doesn't look like this is going to allow it. So fascinating. Let me see if I can try some other way of sharing with you. Was all of that basically what you had in mind, what you all were thinking? Okay, well, I need somebody to unmute. Okay, thank you, because I'm going to ask you right now, if I go to this thing that says the other secret, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this is the presentation that I give generally for PhD students, and it's about developing a table of evidence. The way Teams is having me share right now, I can't see anyone's faces, so if you have questions or comments, feel free to interrupt me. I always like to call it the other secret because you can see how old this was. The Secret was a big book that came out. But tables of evidence are incredibly helpful, and getting them down really jump starts your research. So when do we start to develop a table of evidence? I mean, you have these thoughts and ideas, and they can come from your clinical setting that you're working in. Maybe you notice something that's going on, you want to explore it more deeply, or you're doing some sort of academic research, and this is kind of an expected part of the pathway. Or you're just a curious person, and you want to know why we do things the way we do, throughout our nursing reach. But also sometimes there's some new health policy that emerges, and you want to understand what was the foundation for these changes, especially in evidence-based practice. What were we doing, and why is that no longer what we're doing? In general, you're going to be doing a table of evidence before you start a paper. And when I say paper, I mean some sort of project, because in my world, I am always looking at whatever I'm doing in the service of disseminating some product. So if you can do some pre-work that makes the dissemination part of the scientific process easier, that's really what you want to do. But I do have to warn you, when you do a review of the literature and create a table of evidence, you're unlikely to get a perfect answer to your research question. And that's actually why we do original scholarship, because if somebody else has already done the question that you're interested in, then you can just read their paper. But more likely than not, you have a unique spin on the phenomenon that you want to explore, which means you're not really going to find anything that perfectly answers it. But it's helpful to remember that research is a conscientious process of assembling pieces of a puzzle from reputable sources and collecting them into an understanding of the current state of the science. So when you're trying to answer a research question, you can retrieve hundreds of thousands of articles. This definitely happened to me when I typed in like diabetes interventions. That it just wasn't great. Some are useful, but some are just not useful, and it's really overwhelming. So in order to tame the mental clutter, I found the table of evidence is the most useful way to organize this information. So the purpose of the TOE is to organize, but it's also a quick reference for you when you're planning your intervention or when you're actually writing up the paper that's going to result. It'll help you identify patterns and trends in the research that's out there that will help you kind of understand what's been tried before. It was something that seemed really interesting. How come it was just kind of stopped? Nobody does that anymore. You'll be able to see some larger things by laying it out this way. And of course, you can recognize gaps, which is super helpful if you're at the very beginning of your research process. So this is a table of evidence, and this is the standard UCLA School of Nursing table of evidence. Lots of different universities have kind of a standard table of evidence format that they use. I like this one. I don't know if we have one at SMU. This has worked for me, but we can certainly develop one internally. I think it's important for all of us to have research that looks similar, so that if we were to be audited either by a journal or potentially by a funder, we know what we expect to see, and we can kind of show them something that's systematic. So for this particular class, I was interested in Hispanic Latino grandparent influence on obesity in grandchildren. And that was my original title. But as I started to retrieve articles, what I realized was that you could actually organize even deeper than just putting them into the table of evidence, because these documents are reflecting experiences across a lifeline that was basically birthed through young adulthood. And so I started to organize that way, and you can see light blue was infancy, so any articles that had to do with that stage. Light pink really focused on adolescent, and light green really focused on young adulthood. So by being able to recognize that pattern just using the table of evidence, it got me thinking about how I wanted to write this up when I went to publish it, because I've already sort of created a mental framework that I'm building on.
Adrienne, we weren't able to see the colors that you were referencing. All we see is just the table with the gray.
Oh, yeah, mine too. This was just a snapshot, sorry. Okay. But thank you for telling me. The idea here is that I'm going to go through each one of these sections, and I'm speaking quickly because we're a little time limited. Do feel free to interrupt me. And again, this is just my humble opinion on what's helpful, so you may vary it based on your own needs. So the first section, the citation, is the easy money because you're just copy pasting that. APA is always the way I save my citations because most nursing journals are comfortable with that. Some like MLA and JAMA, but APA is going to get you through most of the time. I generally try to only look at manuscripts that have been published within the last 5 years. You can see how old this presentation is. Or if it's a landmark study or it's a population that's really understudied, it's okay to go back past that. But in general, there may be a reason why we no longer use that particular intervention, and you may not catch it if you're getting things from like 2010. If you need help with citation, Purdue OWL is the best website out there. That's the link, but you can just type in Purdue OWL, and it will help you with not only citation formatting, but also how to like cite in text, how to write the initial letter to the editor, all of that great stuff. Good resource. So the purpose of the study, which is the second bar, is really, exactly what it says. It should be very clearly stated, and it should reflect the goals of the paper. Now, sometimes people, when they're in the dissemination phase, have this big grand project plan and they weren't able to get any usable data. So they massage the purpose of the paper to allow them to still publish on some of the stuff that they happen to discover, right? It's unfortunate that our system is set up the way it is, where we have to publish or we don't really get credit necessarily. But that can mean that you end up with papers where the purpose in no way seems to match what they came up with. So basically, my golden rule is if you can't find the purpose of the paper in the first page or two, don't read the article. Because if the authors aren't really clear about what they were trying to do, then you shouldn't waste your time trying to understand their process. And it should be very clear. It should be like, the purpose of this study was XYZ. And so in this case, it's written out very clearly. It tells me that they were looking at feeding decisions among a specific population. And speaking of population, for the sample setting kind of section, the who, where, and when, this is really important because when we have a paucity of literature, like many of us do, because we're looking at very specific things, we really need to keep in mind, how is this intervention or this study being affected by the population? And is it similar enough that I can still use it to make my argument, right? So if I'm looking at diabetes interventions, is it in mainland China? Is it in like rural Denmark? Is it with American children, right? Like I need to know whether or not this is going to work for me, because there are some things that work in other unique, smaller populations that are just not translatable to Oakland, for example. So you should find that in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you should be able to just copy and paste that with a little bit of adjustment right into that section. Again, this is going to be helpful for you because if later on you decide you're going to do some sort of meta-analysis, you can go immediately to this and say, okay, my N was 35, and I can think about how I'm going to analyze that for whatever concept it is that I'm exploring. As far as the methods, does the study design match the stated purpose? It's really interesting how often there is a mismatch between how people solved the problem and the problem that they were initially interested in. And sometimes that is some post hoc manipulating of the data and the methods that they're using just to get published. So you really want to catch that by looking at the details. Now, this is the Pyramid of Evidence, and this is the Pollitt and Beck nursing research book. I always encourage everybody to get a copy of Pollitt and Beck. It is the best reference that you can have. But the idea here is when I'm looking at grandparent influence on obesity, do I want to go for systematic randomized control trials? I may not, because I personally don't believe that the current literature reflects the diversity of Latino grandparents. I think that it's done by a lot of outsider researchers who maybe don't have some internal understanding of the culture in a way that's going to be useful to me. So what I'm probably going to look at is something that's more like in the level 6 area of a single descriptive or qualitative study. Even though it kind of is counter this idea of the level of research that is been performed, you really have to do what works for you. So this was a cross-sectional qualitative study, and I kind of mapped out what they did. There were key informants and then focus groups and interviews, and it actually really worked in terms of trying to understand the phenomenon for me. So the results, which is also the findings. Now this is the payoff. When I get a manuscript, or an article, I go right to the results because I want to know, is this clinically significant? It may be statistically significant, right? So a lot of that is kind of digging in and kind of understanding the measures of validity. But try to keep calm because this is one study. And what I tend to find is people have a topic they're interested in, and then they find a paper that seems like it sums up their question. And then they're like, dang, I was going to do that study. Don't worry, you have some unique spin to put on whatever research it is that you're doing, just based on your positionality, the time, and what we call secular events, the fact that the world is different now post-COVID. So there is space for multiple studies on the same topics, especially ones that highlight unique features of the population or the time. Also, don't cut and paste in this section because, oops, sorry. Oh, I thought I had it there. I guess I didn't. So yeah, I was going to say, just don't cut and paste the findings into that little box that should be popping up. For some reason, it's not. Because if you just summarize them, you can use this section and the subsequent section to build papers, to build reports. But if you cut and paste, you're probably going to forget when you cut and paste. And if you use that, that's plagiarizing. And so it's really sticky. I always encourage people to just give a synopsis whenever possible. And there's my little Godfather quote. Again, you don't need to learn everything possible about this phenomenon. It can be really exciting. So I found a paper that talked about how Latina grandparents, grandmothers in particular, prized spouses for their grandchildren that were obese females because they found that obesity in women partners they associated with like people who are interested in family and really family centered and devoted to the relationship and the marriage. And so they have this bias, but they're not feeding them, right? These are outsiders that are coming into the space. So I'm interested in the feeding practices. So even though it's exciting, try not to run with it. Just, leave the gun and take the cannoli. So discussions and limitations here on any article that you read, this is your bread and butter. This is the most important section for you because it gives you insight not only into the data, but the people writing it, right? Because limitations is about the physical limitations, external limitations, but it's also about our own internal limitations and bias, and really understanding that the research process is biased throughout from start to finish. How we make decisions, what we include, what we exclude, what we really value, that's a reflection of who we are as people. So it's important when you're reading the discussion to really think critically. Were they answering the question and who is this person? Think about how useful it is to your particular background, because, and I mean like your background on the topic, because again, it may be fascinating that they prize like obese females for their grandsons, but like that doesn't really help me move forward. So it can be tempting to follow that rabbit hole, but it's not a good use of your time. So the discussion should reflect these previous sections, like the citation. Is this a reputable source? Is this like a pay-for-play journal? Was the purpose clearly stated? And if it wasn't, what's going on here? And for the sample and setting, was there bias? Is it representative? Again, are these American children? Are these, rural Dutch children? It matters. And the methods, did it match? And is it sound? Now that you see the assertions they're making in the discussion, you get a chance to see the holes in the method and say, why didn't they do focus groups? Why did they just do surveys? Because when you do a survey in this particular population, you have to make a lot of assumptions about their lives and what they value. And then finally, the results. There's lots of like validity, generalizability, reproducibility questions when it comes to results, which are, beyond the scope of this class. But it is important to consider it because it can be very tempting to find studies that really express what you have as your inner belief about the phenomenon. And you got to be open to those, but also the ones that totally disagree so that you get a real balanced perspective of where the literature is. And so right here, I've got the discussions limitations. Again, you can organize this however you want, as long as you are summarizing and not copy pasting. So for example, I said, hey, the philosophical theoretical framework was undefined. I mean, that really matters to me because if I'm about to launch into a study, I want to know what are the frameworks that everybody's using on this topic. Again, the generalizability was limited because it was just one hospital in Colorado, right? But other kind of soft notices like, hey, the grandmother role was mentioned a lot, but they didn't really explore it. And this actually might be a significant source of influence in this particular article. So the take homes here is that the table of evidence is just a tool. It's only as good as you make it. And I can distribute the framework, but you can change it or you can do whatever you would like to organize the data. The main thing is to just make sure that it is useful and helpful to you. Don't forget that you are unlikely to get a perfect answer when you're doing some of the background legwork on, developing a project. But that's okay because research is this conscientious process, which means we're going into this with open hearts and minds and good intentions, and we're assembling pieces from reputable sources and collecting them into an understanding of the current state of the science. The reason this matters is because it is such a waste of time for us to start from scratch anywhere. So before you launch into anything you're going to do, stand on the shoulders of giants, then build a reasonable argument or question or exploration that you can kind of grow in this space, and then disseminate it so other people can stand on your shoulders, because that's kind of what we're going for in research. That is it. I am going to stop sharing. Thank you so much, and happy to do questions. And I don't even know how to stop sharing. Let's see how we get there. All right. Any questions? I know that was pretty quick. So I will definitely have this recording posted in the level 1 training, but it's kind of a general summary. Oh, thank you, Shalitha. Okay. So I shouldn't be sharing anymore. Yeah, go ahead.
We are still here. Just want to let you know we're being bad students, not showing our faces.
I know, y'all. I need to see people's eyes. I'm a psych nurse, so I got to be able to see, people's eyeballs. But that's okay. And and I hope I didn't insult anybody. The reality is that this is really below the scope of a lot of people, probably most of the people who would ever watch this. This isn't something totally unfamiliar to you. But if there's anything useful that you can get out of it, even if just as a reminder, sometimes I skip to step 3 because I feel like all this other background work is not a good use of my time. But then I have friends who send me articles that I totally missed because I didn't do a lit review. And they're like, hey, did you see this thing that came out in pediatrics? And I'm like, oh my gosh, no. I'm writing my, my grant, and I'm not doing a lit review. So sometimes it's a helpful backward step.
I think it was a very good reminder on how to structure. It's very helpful to go back and look at the TOE again, because I think it keeps you organized in your thoughts. So thank you for the reminder. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, I don't want to keep anybody past the time. I am available for anything that I can support you with, and I'd love to hear about your individual projects and hopefully make some connections between you all. But thank you for hanging out, and yeah, best of luck to everybody on where you are with your research, and let's make sure that we're really leveraging each other as experts in this space, because there's a lot of, there's a big brain trust here at SMU, and if we can work smarter instead of harder on anything, it's always the way to go.
Are you able to stay on for about a minute? I do have a question.
I'm going to stop recording, but anybody who wants to stay on is welcome to hang out.
Thank you.